Rama, Rama, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, 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 Rama. Hari Ram, Hari Ram, Ram Ram, Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Ram, Rama, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama, Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, 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 Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama, 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 Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama, Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama, 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 Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Hari Rama, 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 Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Hari. Okay, devotees, I'm going to read Prabhupada-lilamrita. Everybody's welcome to stay or go or whatever you're comfortable with. It's absolutely no problem and completely up to you. Okay, oops, all right, that's the end of Zoom. Right. Okay. Hare Krishna. So devotees, we are in Srila Prabhupada-lilamrita, Volume 3, Chapter 4, beginning of Chapter 4, which is titled, Our Master Has Not Finished His Work. And last night we finished Chapter 3, and in Chapter 3, Srila Prabhupada left San Francisco and returned to New York after having been in San Francisco for about, I think, 2.5 months. But things in New York had become fairly chaotic due to the attempt to purchase a building with no money, or not no money, but with very little money, relatively, and dealing with real cheaters, real rascals. So now Prabhupada has just landed in New York. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharne Niravishesha Shunyavadi Paschatyadesh Sri Krishna Chaitanya Pramanuchananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. There was no warning that Srila Prabhupada's health would break down, or if there were, no one heeded it. As he moved from his devotees in San Francisco to his devotees in New York, no one passed any words that Swamiji would slow down, After the 5.5-hour jet flight, Prabhupada spoke of a blockading, quote unquote, in his ears, but he seemed all right. He didn't rest, but went straight through the festive airport reception into 3 hours of strong lecturing and chanting in the storefront at 26 Second Avenue. To his New York disciples, he appeared dazzling and lovable, and by his presence, his glances, and his words, he increased their Krishna consciousness. Well, I can say also from my own experience of traveling multiple hours through usually through some sort of different time zones to some degree, but sometimes like really major time zone changes. And you arrive, and oftentimes the devotees are just ready for action. Yes, let's just do a program. Yeah, sure. And so you have to get used to that if you're going to be a traveling preacher. Yes. To them, his advanced age, now nearing 72 years, was but another of his transcendental features. He was their strength, and they never thought to consider his strength. In the temple, speaking from a new dais behind a velvet-covered lectern, Prabhupada said, "In my absence, things have improved." New paintings hung on the freshly painted white walls. Otherwise, it was the same tiny storefront where he had begun his International Society for Krishna Consciousness. He had written them that he wanted to enter the new building on his return, but they had failed, and they had foolishly lost $6,000. Because, first of all, they gave $1,000 to the man who was promising to help and arrange everything. So he said he needed $1,000 because he wanted to go to another city. He needed to travel to another city to free up some money, which he had there, which could then be used for the purchase. But he came back having spent not the whole $1,000, but maybe $300, came back empty-handed. Then he introduced them to this one man, whose name I forget, who was big, multi-millionaire apparently. Huh? The Price is the one who's introducing them. He's the one who took the $1,000. So, yeah, he told them that this other man whose name I forget, he may just buy it for you. $100,000 building. And the deposit on the building, they said, was $25,000, like advance payment. They had 5. So Brahmananda, he went with Mr. Price to this other man, and he walked into the man's office, or what would you say, sort of like his meeting room, big meeting room. And at the end, with spotlight on him was that man. And in front of him were 6 telephones. And they sat down to discuss everything. And every couple of minutes, one of the phones would ring. And eventually he said, okay, sign the contract, give the deposit. So Brahmananda did. And Mr. Price had said, this man, you just give 5,000, he'll give the other 20. Because they had 1 month. From the time you pay the deposit, you have 1 month to, you have 1 month to pay the full deposit of 25. That's what it was. So they paid 5. Now they needed another 20. And as they walked out, Mr. Price said, you got to come up with the other 20 within a month. And Brahmananda asked, what will happen if we can't? And Mr. Price said, you lose your deposit, your 5,000. And then Brahmananda understood he had been conned and tricked and cheated, and they couldn't come up with the rest. But without dwelling on this, Prabhupada made a more important observation. His disciples, despite the physical absence of their spiritual master, had made progress by following his instructions. As he sat looking happily at the freshly painted walls and the bright faces of his disciples, Prabhupada explained how one obtained expertise in Krishna consciousness by submissively following the spiritual master. He gave the example that although an engineer's apprentice may not be an expert, if he turns a screw under the direct supervision of the expert engineer, he is acting as an expert. That's good, isn't it? Many of the devotees were relieved to hear this. They knew that giving up material desires was difficult and that they weren't going to become completely pure devotees overnight. Brahmananda had even written a poem stating that if, after many lifetimes, he could chant 1 round of the Hare Krishna mantra with attention, he would consider this the greatest success. That's interesting, isn't it? But Prabhupada was explaining that even if they weren't expert in love of Krishna, if they worked under an expert, they were also acting as experts. The next morning, with the fanfare of Prabhupada's arrival past, it became apparent just how dependent the devotees were on their spiritual leader. The attendance was down to the 12 or so regulars, and Prabhupada silently entered the storefront and began to lead the chanting. But when the moment came for the devotees to sing in response, and Prabhupada heard their first chorus, he looked out to them, startled and compassionate. Now he could hear they were weak, more like croaking than singing. They had deteriorated in his absence. The kirtans had changed while he'd been away, and now he was hearing what the devotees were like. Helpless souls croaking without joy or verve. Wow, amazing. Excuse me for a moment. Excuse me, please. Srila Prabhupada lectured from Chaitanya Charitamrita. When flying from San Francisco, I noticed that the plane was flying above an ocean of clouds. When I came from India by boat, I saw an ocean of water, and on the plane, I saw an ocean of clouds extending as far as you can see. Above the clouds is the sun, but when we come down through the clouds and land, everything in New York is dim and clouded, but the sun is still shining. Those clouds cannot cover the whole world. They cannot even cover the whole United States, which is no more than a speck in the universe. From an airplane, we can see skyscrapers as very tiny. Similarly, from God's position, all this material nonsense is insignificant. As a living entity, I am very insignificant, and my tendency is to come down. But the sun doesn't have the come down tendency. It is always above the clouds of Maya. A new boy raised his hand. Why is it that one person, one soul, comes to Krishna and another doesn't? It's one of the age-old questions. Sure. Oh, yeah. Prabhupada replied with another question. Why is one soul in the Bowery and another has come to the Krishna temple? He paused, but no one could reply. Because, he explained, because one wants to be here and the other doesn't. It is a question of free will. If we use it properly, we can go to Krishna. Otherwise, we will stay down in the material world. Everyone had something to ask Swamiji. Throughout the day, devotees would be in and out of his room, asking practical and philosophical questions. And they took up their old ways of reciprocating with him. Once again, Prabhupada was telling Achyutananda what to cook for lunch and explaining to him that an expert servant learns to anticipate what the master wants even before he asks for it. Or that, Prabhupada said that the first-class disciple knows without asking what to do for the spiritual master. Second-class disciple has to ask and then gets the information and then does what he or she is told. Then the third-class disciple asks, is told, but doesn't do what they're asked. Something like that. Has difficulty doing what they're asked. Satsvarup came in to show Prabhupada the latest typed manuscripts for teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Although there was no difference in Satsvarup's assignment, now that he was face to face with Prabhupada, he realized he had to type and edit more seriously. He asked whether he could resign from his job at the welfare office. Prabhupada said, no. Jadharani continued painting in the outer room of Prabhupada's apartment. Casting shyness aside, she asked him many questions about how to paint Krishna. How is Lord Vishnu situated in the heart, she asked. Is he sitting or standing or what? Prabhupada replied, oh, for that you have to meditate for thousands of years. Jadharani stared at him in dismay. Then Prabhupada said, he is standing. And she went off happily to paint. When Jadharani complained of weak health, Prabhupada asked Achyutananda to see that she got milk twice a day. Looking through the window that opened into the outer room, where typing, painting, and sometimes even construction went on, Prabhupada watched Jadharani one day as she worked on a painting of Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan party. Just as she started to paint the words of the Mahamantra across the bottom of the painting, Prabhupada called through the window, don't put the Mahamantra there. But you told me to put it there, she said. I've changed my mind. Hare Krishna should not be below Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. I can tell you one little story. Yeah. That Srila Prabhupada was visiting Laguna Beach temple in California, or maybe San Diego, anyway, some temple in California. And the devotees, the practice was, well, like with this thing, this room and everything, they worked right through the last night. Oh my gosh. So when Prabhupada would come, the devotees would always paint the temple. And, Prabhupada's rooms and paint everything. So they painted everything. And one devotee got an inspiration to paint the words of the Hare Krishna Mahamantra on the front steps leading up into the entrance of the building. So he did that, thinking Prabhupada would be pleased to see the mantra. And the devotees, they're just working up to the last few seconds before Prabhupada was driven up in the car from the airport. And so the devotees had painted and cleaned and done this and done that, and then threw everything out the back door. Just, get it out of the way, we'll sort it out, but yeah, so Prabhupada arrived, and Prabhupada walked up to the bottom of the stairs, going up to the entranceway. And he's just about to step on the first step when he saw the mantra painted on the stairs. And Srila Prabhupada said, "Oh no, I cannot step over the mantra." And he went around to the back, which was just, total mess. And they had to pull things apart so he could walk in. Yeah. One by one, Prabhupada saw all his old New York followers. Gargamuni, the temple treasurer, who reported good sales of the Hare Krishna record and incense. Roy Ram, editor of Back to Godhead, who talked about his indigestion. Devotees have interesting things to talk about. And Rupanuga, who had a good job but was having difficulty convincing his wife about Krishna consciousness. Even Mr. Chuti, the landlord, dropped by with complaints about the boy's behavior. Prabhupada also met Michael Blomert, a newcomer. Michael had been seeing a psychiatrist as a result of devastating drug experiences. When he had begun coming to the temple, his father and mother had thought the Swami another evil force. On meeting Swamiji, however, Mrs. Blomert accepted his authenticity, although her husband remained doubtful. "Mr. Blomert," Srila Prabhupada said, "your wife is more intelligent." Mr. Blomert said he wanted his son to help the world in a more practical way by becoming a doctor. Prabhupada argued that there are already so many doctors, but still people are getting sick. A Krishna-conscious person, however, could relieve a person's suffering completely. So the work of Krishna consciousness was more valuable. Mr. Blomert was unconvinced, but he agreed to let Michael stay with the devotees and drop going to the psychiatrist. He came to respect the Swami, even though disagreeing with him. With Brahmananda, Prabhupada discussed the urgent problem of obtaining a permanent visa. Prabhupada had repeatedly extended his visa ever since he'd entered the country in 1965. Now immigration officials denied him any further extensions. He didn't want to leave the United States, but the only way he'd be able to stay would be to get permanent residency. He had applied, but so far with no success. "Your government doesn't want me to stay," he had said, "so I may have to go back to India." Swamiji's going back to India was a frightening prospect. His disciples had barely been able to accept that he would leave them for preaching elsewhere in the United States. If he were to go back to India, they feared they might fall back into the material world. He was sustaining their spiritual life. How could they go on without him? And Prabhupada felt the same way. Brahmananda managed to find a lawyer to delay the proceedings of the immigration office. The threat of deportation passed. Prabhupada spoke of going to Montreal and getting permanent residency there. But his main intention was to stay in America and cultivate what he had begun. Brahmananda reported to Prabhupada about printing the Bhagavad Gita. The manuscript was ready, and they were considering the costs and where to print it, even though they didn't have enough money to publish the book themselves. They hadn't seriously attempted the arduous process of finding a publisher, but Prabhupada pushed Brahmananda to do so. He said, "The only hope is that I have my books." Brahmananda also talked with Prabhupada about the $6,000 he had lost to Mr. Price. Prabhupada insisted that they prosecute the culprits. He sent Brahmananda to speak with various lawyers and also to tell Mr. Price and Mr. Tyler that His Excellency, that's what Mr. Price called Prabhupada, Your Excellency, His Excellency was back and would take them to court. At that they relented. Mr. Tyler refunded most of the $5,000 deposit, and Mr. Price returned $750 of the $1,000 he had wheedled out of Brahmananda. The legal services had cost more than $1,000, so that was lost. But Prabhupada said that when dealing with a tiger, you can expect to get scratched. In a letter to Kirtanananda in Montreal, Prabhupada described the successful termination of the Price affair. You'll be glad to know that I've been able, by grace of Krishna, to recover $4,227 out of the $5,000 gone in the belly of Sir Conman fraud Price. Sure. Okay. Okay, devotees, we will carry on tomorrow. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.